do a deeper dive into this with Ambassador John Bolton, who served as U.S. National Security Advisor during the Trump administration and was the U.S. Ambassador to the UN under George W. Bush. Ambassador, always good to see you. The news from this weekend was extraordinary. It had the world's attention. What were your initial takeaways as you watched these developments start to unfold?
Well, this was obviously something that should concern the regime in Moscow quite a bit. It was a threat to Putin. I think he emerges from it weaker. There's no doubt about it. But I also think, both in terms of the attempted coup, the supposed settlement, and predictions for the future, we have vastly insufficient amounts of information really to comment with any confidence. I think it may well be the threat of Prigozhin's action, sending his military toward Moscow, was overstated in many cases. I still don't know what the deal that ended the effort and caused the Wagner Group troops to turn around includes. Yeah. The Russian government has said contrary things. And in terms of what happens in the future, what really matters here is what happens on the battlefield in Ukraine in the next couple of weeks. If the Ukrainians can take advantage of the disarray we saw over the weekend, that could be very significant. But we don't know. It's early days on that yet.
And Ambassador, speaking of that, I was curious, what was the United States, or what should be the United States stance on this? Obviously, Prigozhin, Putin, neither are a friend to America. But as it pertains to Ukraine and the war there, what was our stance? Were we hoping for a civil war there? Were we hoping for more of a Wagner win? Or how should the U.S. be thinking about this?
Well, I don't think there's anything we should be doing about it. I think the ultimate concern is always the security of Russian nuclear forces. I don't think there's been any evidence so far anyway that their security was in danger, that we had to worry about either the use of nuclear weapons or some of the nuclear weapons getting into the wrong hands. But that is a question of watching and not commenting. Remember, what Putin will try to do now, as dictators often do, is distract the Russian people from his internal crisis by threatening on the external threat of the war in Ukraine. And it's been a theme of his from the get-go that the breakup of the Soviet Union was an American plot, that these new independent states, they're not new anymore, but like Ukraine, are illegitimate and should be brought back into Russia. The expansion of NATO is another U.S. plot. So for the U.S. to have had a visible role, I think would only have played into what I expect Putin will do now, try to rally the Russian people around him in support of the troops in Ukraine.
And one of the chief concerns that world leaders do have about Putin, obviously, is his arsenal of nuclear warfare. And right now, he's vulnerable. That was the most direct challenge and threat to him since he became president. How worried should we be about a vulnerable Putin right now? And is he a safer option than other alternatives?
Well, I think one of the circumstances, one of the limited number of credible circumstances that I've always thought Putin might consider the use of tactical nuclear weapons is if his regime were threatened. Now, I've heard so far, and I underline so far, no evidence that any nuclear weapons were moved during this past weekend, and any indication Putin might be thinking about it, which could tell us something about how threatened he was. But that is something we need to watch. In terms of the potential alternative leaders in Russia, I don't think there's anybody to write home about. And I think one of the things we have to consider is, while the war with Ukraine is still going on, if there's tension within Russia leading to a weaker regime, you could see possibilities for Russia itself to break apart, which would give China huge potential in Asia. I'm not much of a fan of Russia under Putin. I'm less of much of Asia being under further control by China.
Well, Ambassador Bolton, as Secretary Antony Blinken said, that this would not be the last act. And we'll be talking with you soon about this, I'm sure. Thank you for your time.
Thank you for watching. Go to newsnationnow.com to find NewsNation on your television provider. And don't forget to click the red subscribe button below to get more of NewsNation's fact-driven, unbiased coverage.